I'm so glad that we are finally doing this. This has been a dream of John Willis and I for many, many years. So assembled today, we have an incredible group of experts. Sidney Dekker, professor at Griffith University in Brisbane, where he founded the Safety Science Innovation Lab and is also honorary professor of psychology at the University of Queensland. He's the author of many books on safety, including his most recent book, The Safety Anarchist. Dr. Spear, someone who's influenced my thinking more than anyone else I can think of, senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Dr. Spear is a senior fellow for the Institute of Healthcare Improvement and was a 4-time recipient of the Shingo Prize for Research Excellence. He is the author of The High Velocity Edge and has extended his research beyond manufacturing to research and development, workplace safety, healthcare, and many more. Dr. Richard Cook. He's a practicing physician, research scientist at The Ohio State University, Department of Integrated Systems Engineering. Dr. Cook has been focusing on resilience and safety and is well known in the DevOps community for his chapter in the web operations books, Why Complex Systems Fail. Thank you so much for being here. John Willis, my longtime partner in crime. John Willis is the Vice President of DevOps and Digital Practices at SJ Technologies. Prior to SJ Technologies, he was the Director of Ecosystem Development for Docker, which he joined after the company he co-founded, Socketplane, was acquired in 2015. John was on the founding team behind the first DevOps Days and is a co-author with me on the DevOps Handbook.
Thank you, Gene.
What an adventure we have been on for the last 7 years.
Thank you.
And part of that is this event today, which I think you and I have discussed as potentially historic. So to the illustrious panel here, each one of you are associated with an incredible body of knowledge that you've created, or at least contributed to creating. Could each one of you describe in a couple of minutes your journey? Dr. Dekker, can we start with you?
I've made a commitment, and that is to write books faster than my fan base can keep up reading them. And so that keeps me busy. So, and I seem to succeed at that, or they just don't read at all. But no, so my mom thought it was good for me to study psychology at some point. That seemed to fit. And so I started with that. And then after psychology, I got a PhD in engineering. After that, I got to be professor pretty early in life, and that became sort of an existential crisis, Gene, as in, oh my, do I have to do this, another 34 years? And so then I thought I joined the ops community, which it represented for me at least, and became an airline pilot on the side. While I was dean and professor, I was flying about a day a week out of Copenhagen down to the Mediterranean and North Africa, and actually get to do the stuff that you talk about. And so rather than dev, I became ops. And the fantastic advantage of that obviously is that you'd be the first to arrive at the scene of the accident, right? So it sharpens the mind a little bit. And having 189 lives in your hands while you're making these decisions and while you have to create a safety climate or culture within your little operational unit is much more real than just talking about it. And so since then, I have been seeing the things that I think should talk about across a whole range of industries, and patterns repeat themselves, and there's commonalities that I hope to discover with the others here today that I think can mean something for the wider community.
And then just to be specific, in a wide variety of industries, these are dangerous.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah,
resource
So
extraction.
high consequence domains, and so where people die if things go wrong, and lots of people can die, and lots of innocent people can die. And so, of course, in aviation, we kill in big batches, right? And so, but that's true for petrochemicals, mining, and transportation in general. Some healthcare, although I'm certainly not the expert at the table for that. But so yeah.
Excellent.
Good point.
Dr. Spear.
Oh yeah, hey, so I got to graduate school as part of the generation that was worried about Japan. It was the late 1980s, Japanese companies were decimating American companies, and the question was why? And if you look at the explanation, back in the early 80s, it was cultural attributes, which I think quickly got dismissed, but then it was technological. People were looking for the secret robot, the secret source of automation. It might be secret tools and algorithms for production control to bring stability to otherwise chaotic systems. And it turned out that anything that someone could buy, robot for example, anyone else could buy. And there was a whole wealth of research by some real luminaries, a guy named J.J. Kumar, Steve Wheelwright, some of those other characters, which said, well, you know, the technology may be important, may be necessary, but it's not sufficient to explain the gaps in performance. It really comes down to people and how people are embedded in and managing these very, very complex dynamic systems for high performance. And so the reason we went to look at Toyota is Toyota was one of these companies which was decimating the big three. The explanation for that was at first cultural. Well, it's a Japanese thing, which in fact is actually not, but it was explained that way. Or it was technology, you know, lean production control tools. When we got to Toyota, we realized that they had created an organization and a culture of tremendous scientific energy. I think the first one of our early quotes with my mentor, Kent Bowen, we wrote that Toyota had figured out how to create a community of scientists where they're constantly discovering. And so you'd asked, you know, our transition over the years. So I think when I started my work, I was probably the Toyota guy, and then maybe for a brief period an auto guy, and then an industry guy. But really my career has converged down to the singularity of advocating for the scientific method, that everything we do represents our best understanding. And our best understanding is imperfect. And so what we have to do is expose our best understanding to ridicule quickly and often to figure out where we're wrong so we can correct on that.
And just to dwell on the past for a moment, I think what caught so many people's attention was the Harvard Business Review paper, the decoding the DNA of the production system, based on your PhD doctoral thesis. That was where you worked on the plant floor of a tier 1 Toyota supplier for 6 months. That is correct. Yes.
And Gene, I re-quote that all the time. I think it's my favorite line in that report is that, you know, it was a community of scientists continually experimenting. Which is, like, that's what Facebook does. That's what Google does today.
Yes, and let me just add one more annotation on that, because I think it's actually profoundly important, because oftentimes we think about science and knowledge work more generally as the domain of the elites, whether it's, you know, in this country it's not by class, but it's by education and credentials or what zip code you happen to live in. And what Toyota realizes is that you can, if you manage properly, you can harness the experimental, exploratory instincts of everybody, regardless of their pedigree. And when you do that with all your people and your competitor is doing it with some 5% of their people, you're bringing a much bigger team and a much better team. So you're going to win consistently.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Spear. Dr. Cook.
I have a misspent youth in the computer industry. Back in the days of punch cards and finite element models and things like that. And at some point along there, I decided to torpedo my career and go into medicine, so I quit my job. I was trying to get out of what I thought was a fast-changing area with lots of innovation and new things that required lots of learning, and moved to a fairly slow-paced area where nothing changed very much. And so I went off to medical school. I've had a fairly productive 30-year relationship with David Woods at Ohio State University, also had influenced on Sidney. And in the process, we've been looking at a variety of issues related to how systems fail and a better understanding of how systems fail. Initially promoted by or based upon studies of big technological failures like 3 Mile Island, but then branching out into a whole variety of different areas. And over my career, I've looked at military systems and telecommunication systems and semiconductor wafer fabrication and a variety of healthcare settings and just a whole bunch of different industries and at the failures in all these different places, sometimes very spectacular ones, sometimes relatively minor ones. Beginning in the 1990s, when patient safety became a popular term or popular area of concern, it became clear that there was a kind of disconnect between our vast capability to do things on the one hand and the fact that the things that we were doing were also causing injuries and harm on the other. And the juxtaposition of those two things became a really profound source of of discontent and disillusion, and this generated a whole series of
disillusion from who? Your disillusion?
Disillusion from among the population that wanted to be able to use these services and had been told that they were safe. A disillusion among the theorists who couldn't understand how the system, which seemed to be producing all these good things, was also producing the bad ones. Disillusion among the regulators and virtually all the parties. And I think it was the confluence of that sense of dis-ease that generated the patient safety movement, and I had the privilege of participating in some of the early stages of that. Trying to bring in what we'd already known about how systems fail, how complex systems fail. In the past, I'm also a practitioner. I'm an anesthesiologist. I put people to sleep and wake them up. I've been doing that for going on 30 years. It's been a very humbling experience to be in contact with this. In this way, we share the kinds of experiences that Sidney talked about and that the people here at this conference would be experiencing. That is, many of them, not only talk about the work, but actually do the work and experience what that's like. And I think it's a very important perspective to have, because you understand what's really at risk, what really matters, and also gives you a big appreciation for how uncertain and how ill-behaved the world very often is. Right now, my focus is on trying to understand where the resilience in systems comes from, and we've come sort of full circle from trying to focus on failures to trying to understand why there aren't so many failures. The thing I'm pretty well known for saying is that the surprising thing is not that your systems sometimes fail, it's surprising that they ever work at all. And that's really true, given the levels of complexity and the pace of change, the kinds of varieties of challenges that they encounter. It is surprising that the systems that we have work. And we're trying to understand more about that, and as we do, we're developing relationships with a variety of different groups. There's a collection that I call a snafu catchers, which is a consortium of companies and people interested in trying to understand this, and we've been working on trying to expand that. We can talk a little more about what the sources of resilience are, but I think that the key thing is that we find them here in the DevOps world, and we can identify those and bring those forward. And there's much in common, and there's big resonance between what we find there and what we find across other industries.
Do you know, what's your quote about Murphy's Law?
Yeah, this is an important one, obviously. That Murphy's Law obviously says that which can go wrong will go wrong. Well, that's actually not the case, and it backs off exactly on what Richard says. That which can go wrong usually goes right. Right? It's actually Bill Langerwish who said this, and that's very true. That which can go wrong usually goes right, and then the risk is that we draw the wrong conclusion.
Yes.
Right. Good. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So each one of you, for better or for worse, has made incredible contributions to your respective fields. And I suspect that when people think about you, they think about the work that you did maybe 10 years ago, as opposed to the work that you're doing now. So could each one of you take an opportunity to say what are specific corrections you might want to broadcast out to the universe in terms of people know me for X, but I'd rather be known for Y. Dr. Cook? If applicable.
I'm not sure many people know me, so I don't think I feel like I have to respond to that one.
You could just make it up.
It has been said.
I'm convinced that what matters now is trying to understand how it is that people are able to make the systems that we have work. And understanding that's both a deep problem and a very interesting one. And given the kinds of challenges that we're facing and we're likely to face, it's critical work that has to be done now. And we are just beginning that process, and that's what we're focused on.
And the reason why, if applicable, many of in our community, we see the work that you're doing with Dr. Woods, with the velocity community, talking about specific application of this body of work to what we do every day. So in many ways, I think our understanding is actually very contemporary. Not just the crazy doctor showing up at velocity conferences. Dr. Spear, I suspect many people just know you as the Toyota production systems person, the HBR article from 1999. So how about you? What is the correction that you would make?
Yeah, the corrections. So I think people should think about two things, feedback and God. Right. And here's what I mean. So there's, man plans, God laughs. And the reason man plans is he tries to bring his best understanding to situations, because in the absence of planning, then we're pretty much guaranteeing failure. God laughs because we bring in perfect understanding, and it turns out God or Mother Nature or the universe gets a veto on everything we do. So I think it's back to the feedback, which is if we start with the assumption that everything we plan is flawed, then what we really should be doing is seeking aggressively, energetically, relentlessly feedback as early as possible. We don't do that. In fact, as we plan, we start making all sorts of social capital, emotional investments in the accuracy of the plan. And when we start doing that, we start rejecting the possibility of feedback. And once we start rejecting the possibility of feedback, we forget again that when we put the plan into practice, God will laugh at us, or the universe will have its veto.
So I'll answer the question in a minute, but there's multiple things that need unpacking.
In fact, just one.
But just to finish your answer to your question. So when I first started this work, it was very shop floor operations focused, and because we had gone in to try and understand why Toyota, after all that study, had been so poorly imitated, and we realized that in these very complex dynamic operations, they had infused an enormous amount of feedback to trigger self-correction and self-improvement. And I think what we've done, and this is, we managed to generalize from that, it's not just the shop floor. It's no matter where you do your work. You have to solicit feedback quickly, because the universe will get its veto someday.
And Dr. just to make one concrete point.
Yeah.
What you're saying is that it is not for just a domain of highly repetitive, mechanistic work of people working with their hands. It is as applicable to people who work with their heads.
Yes. So actually, Gene, your point is a great one. Is that I think when people looked at Toyota for an example, they look at the end, which is cars coming off the line more, not more often than not, almost always defect-free, compliant with expectations, et cetera, and they say, oh, this must be applicable to repetitive work, which it is, but then they make the false conclusion it's applicable only to repetitive work.
Wasn't it Toyota Ono's famous quote, and it's my own narrative, but he let the American cars come in and they asked him, why do you let them come watch how we do things?
Right.
And my own kind of narrative is he kind of snickers and says, they can copy our process, but they'll never understand our culture.
Yeah, that's right. So connecting those 2 points, right, which is by the time you actually have cars coming off an assembly line every 50 seconds, almost always compliant, right? You've gone through this whole set of processes of designing the car, designing the system, designing the logistics system, actually building those things physically, training people, resourcing equipment. And when that first car comes off the line, let alone the 1,000th, you're multiple years and billions of dollars in your investment of thinking. And what most people do is don't expose their thinking, 2, 3, 4, 5 years in advance of that first car. So then maybe they'll say, oh, what we need to do is put feedback on the system at the very, very end. But by then you've already baked in failure or guaranteed success.
I had a boss who said he raced cars, and he says when the race car crashes into the wall and blows up into flames, he said the mistake wasn't made in that turn. It was probably made 7, 8 turns before, right? That predestined.
Yeah, or in designing a car that can burst into flames.
Right.
or a fuel that doesn't.
Mixed metaphors here. By the way, just a little aside, I think we had joked that the benchmark for this event was the famous debate about morality by Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky. I think we have them beat. I'm having so much fun, John. How about you?
Yep, I think so.
And there's Michel Foucault in the question that you asked.
Yeah.
So Michel Foucault, I'll paraphrase and translate, which is probably helpful. That a person cannot be held to something he or she said 10 years ago. Can a man not change his mind about things?
Look at what he just did.
So, exactly. So, but before I say anything, I mean, I think so, Steve, these are gorgeous points, but I beg to differ on various philosophical and practical grounds, because so first of all, reading external agency or some conspiracy by God or Mother Nature or the universe into the adversarial things that we encounter is hugely infantile. right? I think, and I think
insulted,
deeply
I'm not
misleading.
sure.
You have maybe.
Let's be clear.
Yeah, no, you are, absolutely. But that doesn't matter. That's we're here to talk. It's about the topic, not us, right? If we have no ego in this,
It's an abstraction.
and if we have egos in this, then it's not going to be a good debate. Of course, it's all right. I'm Dutch. I'm direct. There's no anyway. So, but the point is, I think it is misleading. If we want to do something about this and try to understand where the sources of failure and success lie, is to say, well, we're imperfect, we try our best, but then there's this external force that somehow screws us up. The source of failure and success is both in ourselves and our own complex systems. No, I'm not done talking. I'm done talking.
Right.
And then to suggest that we ignore feedback, I mean, that is entirely inconsistent with all the evidence that I sit on. But as soon as we deploy something, we seek all kinds of feedback, but we count only what we can count. We don't count what counts. And so the feedback that we do solicit is not helpful in us understanding how the thing were going to go wrong. And so finally, I mean, this debate was done like 250 years ago. I mean, Voltaire, right? Voltaire, 1755, after the Lisbon earthquake, essentially ridiculed the whole notion that the best laid plan of mice and men go to crap because of some external agency. I don't think we need to have that debate again.
I think so. Not that Dr. Spear needs
I haven't
my
answered your
defense,
question yet.
But I'm going to take a crack at it. I think he means God in a metaphor sense.
No, but I think the metaphor is wrong. This is the whole point. It is misleading.
It's uncertainty. I mean, let's just call it uncertainty.
I know. But
That
so
you can't-
let's not put a label on it that says, it's external to us, right? Because that is the illusion that gets us to think completely wrong about these things. We are the source of both success and failure in this.
Yeah, so Sidney,
right?
I think my attempt at metaphor was not as clear as it needed to be.
There you go. Language matters. Language matters.
What I mean to say is the universe operates the way the universe operates. You put a force.
But we're part of it. We're not
All
external
right,
to it.
now it's his turn.
We put forces on masses and they predictably accelerate in proportion to both the mass and the force. And there are other rules written into the fabric of the natural universe. We are part of that, but our understanding of it is grossly imperfect. And if you look at anything that fails, unless it was something intended and designed by a sociopath, it fails not due to intent, our own intent, it's due to our lack of understanding. That when we sit here today and we're, whether we're 5 minutes, 5 hours, or 5 years out from the actual event, we're characterized by an enormous amount of ignorance about what actually will transpire.
So, but so I have to throw some big words on the table. But the Newtonian Cartesian ontology that this is, right, that there is such a thing as a possibility of perfect understanding, is deeply misleading. There isn't in a complex system. There is no such thing. It is all imperfect. You only know, right? And so
I think of it as there's a true north, and if I'm always pointing
nonsense. That shifts.
That
shifts.
But it doesn't matter. You're constantly improving to get there,
There-
and you're using scientific thinking, so you're always course correcting. It's like
Delightfully
cybernetics.
optimistic.
I have
Is that not the core of sort of the lean?
Maybe just to put we're
I haven't answered your question yet, by the way.
Yeah. In fact, I'll.
Mind,
that was
it's irrelevant.
Your fault.
Well, no,
But
it was Steve's fault because I needed to respond.
But actually, just one thing. I mean, I think we all agree that entropy exists. That I mean, without even getting into the quantum mechanics, that would suggest that there is.
These
I
are
think that
byproducts of
supports.
complexity, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Uncertain.
I just don't see them as mutually
I think
contradictory.
so. So let me see if I can find something that adds some clarity to this. And this is an attempt. I'm not sure it's going to work. Sidney's point about complexity, I think, is an important one, which is that we are dealing with complex systems, and therefore we both take action on them, and they take action on us. We are not. It's not a deterministic world. We cannot create a system. We can influence different things. We can try different approaches, but there are responses in the world that change the way those things play out and alter the kinds of pathways. So we are not in a position where it is simply our intent, but our ability to understand both the way that our intentions are going to play out in the short run, but also the kind of responsiveness that the system has and how it's going to react to that. The bottom line here is that this is about adaptive systems, and people are adapting, and they are adapting in this world to the various kinds of changes that are going on. And when we trace those patterns of adaptation, we discover various kinds of patterns that we can sometimes deploy. I think that it is a mistake for us to become too focused on a kind of sort of philosophy of how this works, because I think the danger is that we begin to think about making progress in a kind of semantic way.
I think one of my cores of why I wanted to do this, because I think we had a discussion where you thought that lean was a deterministic model, and I was not by what I've read from Dr. Spear, not what I've read from Mike Rother. Mike Rother's Torticata. And so is the disconnect here that you don't like the God or true north, but is direction okay? Because I think, and please help me if I'm wrong, is the model from my two favorite authors in lean, you and Mike Rother. And I think you say the same exact thing, which is that it is a non-deterministic model, and there's some direction. Mike calls it a true north, a challenge, and it's a direction that he says, this is direction, this is my current state, and hold off before you because I'm gonna get the part that challenges uncertainty. Give me a minute. He says there's a current condition, and then there's a target condition, and then I go into the gray zone. And the gray zone is the scientific method of constantly improving and just course correction to get to this direction. I want to get the single piece flow. I may never get there, but if I'm always using scientific method and I embrace uncertainty to get there, which is scientific thinking, then I'm working my way towards
You don't get to talk now.
All right. I mean, I would love to.
Actually, I
want to hear Dr. Spear.
So, yeah, and it's not deterministic. I mean, we are dealing with systems which are complex and dynamic. They keep changing, and they keep changing, I guess, in an adaptive fashion, in that they never return to an initial state. That no matter what you do, it's always a change state. So as a layperson, when I first heard the term homeostasis, consistent state, I said, oh, it implies that there's some sort of balance in biological systems. And once you get to that balance, it just stays there. One of the things that's been impressed upon me, of course, is that there's never balance. That you exert yourself, your body adapts. You eat something, your body adapts. And it gives the appearance of balance because of all these adaptive mechanisms going on biologically. One of the things that's been impressed upon me even further is that these adaptive mechanisms happen at the large scale in terms of release of hormones and that sort of thing, but even smaller scale adaptation within cells and even adaptation at the level of genetics. And so it's this idea that your state at time t is your starting point for t plus delta t, but no matter what happens at t plus delta t, even if you leave the situation alone or act on it, you never go back to the state at t. You go to the state of t plus another delta t. And so, again, to your point, it's not deterministic. You're constantly searching. Now, that's the biological system, but the systems you embedded yourself in aircraft. I mean, aircraft don't go up and someone deterministically designs an aircraft. It depends on a tremendous amount of adaptive control to keep a plane going where the pilot wants. And
it's not complex. It's only complicated.
Well, I think. Well, let me finish. So I think you're quibbling over some of the semantics. The issue is the plane will not go where you intend unless you have feedback at multiple nested levels. You have it at the individual components, the components within systems, meaning that you as a pilot have to make some critical decisions, but far fewer than the decisions that are being looped into the system itself. So that's where I said with feedback. And again, the reason for feedback being so critical for people making decisions is that the commitment we make today is built on a tremendous amount of ignorance about what's going to happen. And just one last thought, because if I'm going to pull in fields here, I mean, the reason those fellows got Nobel Prizes for option theory is because they quantified, right? They quantified, and Merton also, don't forget Merton, MIT guys, that, right? But the reason they got Nobel Prizes for that is they acknowledged what we all know, which is what's going to happen in the future is unknown today, to certain varying extents. And there's consequently value to be able to make a decision tomorrow when I'm closer to what's actually tomorrow is going to be like. And what they were able to do was quantify the value of that delay on the decision. So again, it's another way of saying In the moment, I am characterized by and plagued by an enormous amount of ignorance about what's going to happen there. And the only way to get closer and closer to what I intend to happen there is to make sure that I'm open to feedback at very quick cycle times frequently and slower cycle times less frequently. But in the absence of feedback, for sure, whether it's biologically or technological, I will crash in the absence of corrective feedback.
And I'm going to make an observation.
Yeah.
There's a technique going to the balcony and looking at the dance floor. I would just love to give ourselves a permission, if there are no objections, to sort of dwell here for a little bit, because I think that would be a great goal to be able to say, all right, I think we have some view of the universe, that the universe is uncertain, complex. I just want to make that, I want to paint that as a intermediate goal.
Let me talk about.
Actually, does that work for you?
Yeah, I think that the problem, of course, is that when we say things are uncertain or we say they're complex, we are not our heads, but we don't have a complete agreement about what all the implications of those things are, how they play out, and what that implies for how we should proceed.
That sounds like semantics to me, by the way.
Well, maybe it might be,
Sounds
but let me back up here and tell you what motivates some of the work that we do, and why I think it plays in the DevOps world. What we find is that when people design systems and build systems in a variety of different settings, their understandings are, as you point out, imperfect or incomplete in a variety of ways, but their goals are usually pretty straightforward. And the goals that they pursue are the ones that help shape the kinds of structures that they build. And in many cases, what they build are structures that achieve some aspect, some component of that sort of stuff, but misrepresent or mischaracterize or underestimate the potentials for various kinds of failures in a variety of different ways. And so we end up with a system that's well designed to produce something, and we've focused on that something, and yet we may not be at the same time building a system that is, for instance, sustainable over a long period of time, or capable of weathering a various serious kinds of storms, or that does not produce some epiphenomena, some other things that are actually damaging or problematic. And as a consequence, we end up discovering those things later on. We build systems and we try to make them as robust as we think we need to, but then our experience with these things begins to demonstrate that we are miscalibrated. And we can take Air France 447, we can take 3 Mile Island, we can take a variety of failures, Night Capital and a variety of others, as examples of where we've really misunderstood the implications of what it is that we are building in fundamental ways that produce new paths to failure that we did not really comprehend at the time that we were building.
But you know, there's an interesting thread here because there's what we have to manage and what we create. I would say the most relevant piece of DevOps has been Lean, because Lean has influenced more, and I think your stuff on complexity and on how we operate and how we deal with complexity once we have this, 100,000 or 1 million servers. But the most dominant model that has influenced everything I've been doing in this space since I've been doing it is the kind of single piece flow. Eric Ries's Lean Startup, which comes directly from there, about how do we deliver things. And a lot of that is built on the scientific thinking of, I'm going to build, I want to create, there was an early story of a company that I worked with that they had this thing about where to get the bars. And they wrote this web interface, and they followed the Eric Ries Lean Startup model. And what they found was that didn't work. They became this thing for where happy hours were. Right, so they course-corrected and what
was the goal?
The goal was to be like an iPhone application for where to find a cool bar and all that. And what they found was through minimal viable product and kind of really just lean thinking, it got them to a place where they were really making the money was identifying where all the happy hours are. And that model of lean has just influenced the stuff you work on. When you have like a Night Capital, it is so complex. That's
the trading firm. Small configuration error caused
8 servers. I mean, I'll get yelled at by you, but 8 servers. The admin missed the 8 server, but we know that wasn't the reason.
So let me
actually could I pause? I mean, so I thought what you submitted, as a characterization of the world as it exists, full of uncertainty, incorrect assumptions, whether we build something or run something. Can we all agree that that's a fine place to be? And can we gain? Do we all accept that? It doesn't seem anything controversial. There's nothing controversial about.
No, I think the only nuance that I would like to add, and I don't think Rich would disagree, would be that once we discover that our previous models are no longer valid because we are now discovering that through a particular failure, these systems create pathways that we hadn't foreseen. Once we've made that discovery, I think the only thing that I would like to call for is equal humility, because it doesn't mean that we are now closer to some ground truth of full knowledge and perfect knowledge, right, to use Steve's word, of how the system actually does work, because that will be, in complex systems, will be forever out of our reach, right? Nor does it mean that that pathway will repeat itself.
Could we pause for a moment? Do we all agree on that statement? Or are there any other qualifications, or can we declare that we're all in agreement as that as a frame?
If you can't agree with that, it's not a complex system. Theory is pretty clear on that.
Dr. Spear, your thought?
Yeah, I think we're always plagued by ignorance, and the sooner we find that out, the better. Just because we learn something doesn't mean we learn something and that we're getting towards some end point where eventually we'll acquire complete and perfect knowledge.
Very good.
All right.
But let me take that one step further now.
We're not.
Oh man!
Hold on.
No, kidding.
So this connects to the lean idea, and I want to propose an idea which might link these things together in a way that would make them at least congruent. The notion of lean depends very much on the idea of value mapping. The ability to understand what is valuable is crucial because it sets the guidance for what we are trying to pursue. Is that a reasonable statement?
So it's a reasonable statement based on the reading of the lean literature. Yeah. It's an inaccurate, and this is not you, this is the literature, it's an inaccurate understanding of what Toyota created.
I can't possibly talk about Toyota, but we use lean a lot in the U.S. And so let me just say that I think the problem, the problem that we arrive at very often is the issue of what is value and how do we define value. And the thing that I'm concerned about, irrespective of the underlying theory about how things ought to work, is that in application, very often what this is a means of essentially eliminating everything that does not add to a bottom line.
Why don't we start by having Sidney, you educate us on safety culture, and then Richard, I'll ask you to expound, reinforce, or maybe even paint how your perspective is a little bit different. So Sidney, why don't you educate us?
Well, educate is, that puts the bar pretty high, I suppose. But what we've learned over the last 20, 25 years is that a safety culture is a culture that allows the boss to hear bad news. I mean, it is that simple. I mean, there's a huge literature, but most of it is wrong, and some of it is useless. But that remark does cut across a lot of the data. A culture that allows the boss to hear bad news. Now, there's two things that we need to look at then. How do you actually create possibilities for the boss to hear bad news, good news, any news that has everything to do with leadership and creating a climate of psychological safety where people feel safe to speak up and won't lose their face or reputation for suggesting that things are not as they may have seemed. And that is actually, and the evidence is quite clear on this, is that's actually the easy part. I mean, it's not easy, it's certainly not easy, but it's the easy part compared to knowing and deciding what is bad news. And this goes back to some of the discussions about feedback, for example, that we've already had. What counts as bad news, right? And so the issue that we see is that people in complex, dynamic, socio-technical systems, or any system really, normalize, right? If you get certain results and you get them over and over and over, you normalize to them. And in some sense, it becomes very difficult to understand that in that normalization, what counts as bad news.
Forgive me, the well understood term I think is normalization of deviance. Is that
Yeah, but absolutely normalization of deviance. But the problem is the word deviance, because it is no longer seen as deviance. Otherwise, why would you normalize it, right? And so, only from the outside in hindsight is it easy to say, "Oh, that was deviant. You guys normalize it. You are bad. We are good," right? We somehow have the God's eye view over this thing, which is why I get sort of upset when we make that frame. It's there's always someone who knows better. Well, guess what? There isn't. Not in complexity, right? And so, but normalization. So what is bad news? What counts as bad news? And the only thing you can do, as far as we know, is to keep a discussion about risk alive, invite in different perspectives, get people from different backgrounds to say, is that normal? Right? And then you have a discussion about it. Yeah, this is normal. What do you do? Well, we do this. Oh, really? That sounds really risky to us, right? And then out of that discussion, you can help calibrate what you will see as bad news.
John, we had this great conversation over lunch about Google, just how much research they did to try to figure out what makes great teams great. Do you want to summarize that real quick?
Yeah, I mean, it was, from reading, it was just an incredible amount of research from, they interviewed almost every engineer at Google, they interviewed anthropologists, they just went to every domain, and, it's back to simplicity, answer was psychological safety. I mean, there was a longer version of it, but it was like, just create an environment of psychological safety. Allow the junior person who's been there day one with the senior person who's been there like 40,000 years. The junior says, I don't think that works. Because in IT, like it has always been this horrible, like, why is that person talking right now? I have been running this system for 30 years. You should not be allowed to talk.
For another 8 years.
But Google wanted to make sure that anybody could raise their hand at any time and say, and in fact, it was encouraged. In fact, if everybody agreed, there was a problem.
The thing is, John, and then we can leave this because that's dealt with. But we quickly get lost in sort of elevating or legitimating the voice from below, and that's really nice. And crew resource management does that, and hospitals are full of initiatives to try to make that happen. But I think it overlooks the fact that if the boss, the one at the top of the pecking order, right, of the tree, doesn't feel safe to lose face and say, actually, I don't know. I mean, the climate of psychological safety applies to them as much as it applies to the lower
The assumption is, I mean, again, we were having this conversation at lunch. Like, is there a perfect ideal anywhere? No, never. But if the model is moving towards where everybody's at least trying to be, and from top to bottom. Again, I'll throw my Toyota in. My understanding was everybody had a mentor-mentee relationship across the board, right? So it creates a psychological safety in the ideal, and nobody is in the ideal. But you try to move towards a place, and that was what Google was doing. Is Google perfect? Absolutely not. In fact, some of the recent stuff that's happened there has been horrific. But are they trying to spend incredible amount of energy in learning? They believe that it's somehow immersing psychological safety throughout the organization.
So Richard, why don't you react to Sidney's canonical definition of industrial safety, safety culture? Yes, sir.
I mean, this is a topic that people have talked about and done research on, and there are journals on the thing, and so I can't possibly do it justice in a single phrase. When we watch people who are working in situations where there's hazard around, clearly one of the problems that they have is that they are under pressure to do things in spite of the fact that hazard is present. And they seem always trying to make a distinction or a decision about whether or not the hazard is close enough, large enough, potent enough, significant enough to warrant that they change the behavior that they are doing in some particular way. And in most cases, what we find is that after accidents, after things that come to attention, big events, and you could take big oil platform burns, and you could take airplane crashes, or you could take catastrophic outcomes in hospitals, is that after accidents, everybody will agree that we were miscalibrated about where we should be relative to production, that we should have backed off of production, and we should have been paying more attention to the hazards that were around. The problem is that it's clear in retrospect, it's not so clear in prospect. We understand when the outcome is bad that there may have been opportunities to avoid that outcome. But we overrate or put too much emphasis on those opportunities and how salient they should have been. This is called hindsight bias, and it's a major problem that we have. The problem is to do this looking forward. And it's even more difficult because in most of the worlds, especially in the world of DevOps, there's so much change going on that the pattern of hazard and risk that actually exists out there is not well understood.
And shifts and changes all the time.
It's shifting and changing all the time. And so to remain apprised of that and to be dealing with it in a thoughtful way relative to where we are in our production demands is a constant problem. And that, what safety is how people work that problem out. That's what safety is. Safety is how people work out the difference between where they understand the hazards and risks lie and the kinds of things that are driving them to encroach on those boundaries.
Sidney, in your DevOps Days presentation, you actually talked about just horrific scenes of people falling into equipment, resource extraction, getting killed, right? I mean, these are the just one example of when you talk about the real risk of death. Right? Am I capturing that accurately?
Yeah, but what is fascinating, if we go on what Richard said, is that the sheer presence and clear presence of that risk or hazard, where the difference between living and dying can be half a second, and literally I've done investigations where that is exactly the case, doesn't necessarily sensitize people, teams, organizations to it. And so there's no privilege that they have that DevOps doesn't have.
Well, yeah, in fact, there's even a
Is that
story.
fair, Rich?
I think it's true.
Even told sort of like the way the person died was that as part of routine maintenance, he had to crawl into the machine and was something horrible happened, resulting in his death. I mean, it just hints at the
Crawled into the machine every day, made it work.
crawled into the machine every day.
There's a special.
tunnel.
The problem is acute in DevOps in ways that are, I think, quite different than the example of the machinery. And that is, it's exceptionally hard in our world to know what a small change is.
They're all small.
And
Right.
we live in a world in the IT setting where the change where we have lots of change management. We're very good at talking about this. If the change is going to have this big impact, we have to go through all these different rules. But very often when things fail, it's not that kind of change that people are doing. They're looking at saying, I was just following the standard procedure here. In fact, you'll read that in some of the accident reports. They say people were using a well-established procedure to do X.
And it goes boom in the night.
And it goes boom in the night.
Yeah.
And so one of the difficulties that we have, I think that is a real serious problem in the DevOps world, is the calibration about where those risks and hazards actually lie and how they are changing.
In fact, there's a couple areas that I just would like to explore before I go to Steve. But what you just talked about was, if I understand correctly, these are the characteristics of complex and tightly coupled systems, right? Small changes where the failure patterns are just hard to predict.
And also of systems that have incredible brittleness in them by their design. And so we have circumstances where we accumulate hazards that I sometimes call it dark debt. We accumulate this dark debt over long periods of time. When the Bash shell was written, it was an exercise of a weekend and trying to put together something that would help me do some particular task. But now it's integrated into just about every step of every procedure that we use. It turns out that the Bash shell has a vulnerability in it that nobody realized at the time. Nobody would have thought of exploiting that vulnerability. Nobody would have looked for that vulnerability. Does it come back to bite us? In spades.
And but maybe this is another concrete example, the British Airways failure, right? Something went down, and in the power-up procedures, they knocked out the most critical business operations of the organization for 3 days, stranding 70,000 passengers all across the UK. And the CEO of the international airline group said it's not a power failure, it's not a technology failure. It was a power failure, right? And any rational explanation of this would say this is the most profound business failure, right? This is maybe I shouldn't say failure, accident.
And if we look at what's happening, it seems to me that it's clear that we are becoming ever more dependent upon systems, linking them up in new and inventive ways to take advantage of opportunities, and in so doing, creating an ever more brittle and more difficult to assess infrastructure, such that when these events occur, they are astonishing surprises.
Astonishing surprises.
People don't say, "Oh, I knew that was going to happen." People go, "What? It did what?"
Somebody must have screwed up.
I'll give you an example. I worked with configuration management for many years, some of the tools that you use to configure infrastructure. And the rule of thumb was that you monitored an infrastructure maybe every 30 minutes. We used a tool once at one of the largest banks in the world, and we turned it on to about 10 seconds. And what they thought they had from a configuration management was a model that was a centralized model, how they thought every machine looked every 30 minutes, but in their mind, at any given time, everybody said, this is what the system looks like. When we turned it down to even it was less than 10 seconds, we found out beyond that, there were 1 billion unplanned changes a day that nobody knew about, right? And 1 billion. This is one of the largest banks, right? And so, like, it's not a question whether you write it brittle or you create it brittle. It is just brittle. And then, I know a little about the butterfly effect, but 1 billion unplanned changes a day are just going to create. You couldn't even calculate what that cost in OpEx cost.
No.
Steve, you were.
Yeah, no. So one of the mistakes we make is all right. So where do you get, whether it's resilience or agility? There's a dynamic piece, the feedback piece, which is tracking differently than I thought. Let me find out in 10 seconds rather than 30 minutes, right? So that's the feedback. But there's a structural piece too, which often gets overlooked, which is our brain's ability to understand the complexity of the thing in front of us is pretty limited. And if we couple everything to everything else, our ability to anticipate and visualize the dynamics of those things, particularly when they're subject to conditions we hadn't anticipated, that's pretty much impossible. So we're always going to be shocked and surprised. So there's a structural approach to that, which is tight boundaries and nesting, which is, and so whether it's a person or a technology, have a qualification with a clear definition around what the operating boundaries are, where that qualification actually means something. And then to the feedback part, there are two opportunities. One is feedback on, is the person behaving in a way that appears to be qualified? And if they're not, then we should investigate why. But also, are they operating inside, at the edge, or across one of those boundaries? Because if they're operating across one of those boundaries, we haven't qualified them there. That's beyond the frontier from what we know and understand to what we don't know and don't understand. And your point about this piece of software, I wrote it for a purpose, and actually probably qualified it pretty well soundly for that purpose. Oh, it's working, it's doing this thing, it's a very narrowed application, doesn't affect much. Oh, let's use it everywhere. I never qualified it for everywhere. I qualified it for here, right? And so I think it's this, I think we referred to before, which is what do you need to do? Which is, I think it's this notion of constantly be paranoid that you're venturing to a place which you haven't yet explored, and consequently, whether into a space or into conditions, whatever else it is, which is why you constantly then, you want to be in a 10-second world for feedback and not a 30-minute world for feedback. Because you want to know sooner than later that you ventured into territory which is poorly characterized.
To be clear, that was just an exercise for discovery, because it wasn't actually, the technology couldn't support that.
No, but if you think about it, but the general principle, right? So, and again, in the presence of a practicing physician, so I'll be careful on this, but what would you rather do? Check your blood sugars once a day, once an hour, once a minute, or just have your body do it, in a sort of continuous fashion? And I think most of us would prefer to have a continuous fashion because it means we can have a couple of donuts for breakfast and not worry about going into shock. If we're checking it once a day, we have to have a very, very programmed existence in tightly bounded circumstances, because if we violate any of that, we run into real trouble.
But let me give you, because it is a good example, one of the big problems is that as you try to achieve tighter and tighter control in order to have the benefits of, say, better control of your blood sugar, you begin to discover characteristics of systems that now you didn't previously know about. So we know, for example, that pursuit of tight control of glucose has associated with it a whole bunch of side effects that are actually very dangerous. And we're struggling with trying to figure out exactly how often we should do this. I think that the ability of our technology to carry us into regions that we didn't expect would be problematic is greater now than ever has been in the past.
Without a doubt. And I'm going to just give myself permission to put a question out there, and if things go wrong, I'm just going to withdraw it. But the one thing that John, you reminded me of is that there's a hindsight bias. I mean, this thing that used to be, I think, somewhat obscure, at least from my perspective. It has come to the forefront. You have Thinking Fast and Slow being a New York Times bestseller. Just how that's been integrated into so many disparate domains. Is that consistent with kind of the view of bias in the safety community, or is that inconsistent?
No, I think it's largely inconsistent. I think that the emphasis on bias right now is a social reaction to a variety of social problems, trying to lodge them not in the usual causes, but in other ones. And I think this is way, way overblown. I'm very unhappy with the way that discussion has gone, and I think particularly the idea that we can unbias or debias people through various kinds of things is almost nonsense.
The immediate knee jerk that I have is that I am always suspicious of binary systems. People say, oh, there is this and then there is that. I go, well, hang on. Right? First of all, is it binary to begin with? What about everything in between, right? And so when it comes to human cognition, simplifying it down like that and then thinking that there is a perfect world in which is unbiased relative to which we are somehow deficient, I think sets us on the completely wrong discussion.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think my reading of that is that those guys didn't necessarily write intentionally prescriptively initially. It was descriptive. Say, look at all the ways in which even with the best intentions, our mind will lead us down in a bad direction.
Yeah, my take on Conanahan was that he just wanted you to understand whether you were doing system one, which was quick thinking, and not that they were saying there was a binary approach. Again, I think it's the same theme all the time, is that all he was trying to say was make sure your system two type thinking was that you were breaking down something as opposed to just jumping to a conclusion.
But Sidney's point is a good one, right? Which is those guys invested a huge amount of time documenting all the ways in which we act with confidence when we really shouldn't have confidence. I mean, really should be walking real slow right now, but we don't. And they actually explain why we might have developed those mechanisms for proceeding with confidence and speed when in fact we shouldn't. Again, one of the big concerns is that anytime something ends up in the hands of management, then it becomes a transaction. I'm going to buy this, and we can talk later about, I'm going to transact and buy lean tools or whatever else it is. But it's almost like people said, I'm going to transact and I'm going to buy behavioral economics, which if they actually understood it would realize
It's not for sale.
One, it's not for sale, but if you're making a quick decision to buy it, you're probably making the wrong decision. They didn't read the book.
That
was a thinking fast.
Yes,
not slow.
That's beautiful.
So Sidney and Richard, thank you for teaching us everything that we need to know about industrial safety. Steve, can you teach us about lean, maybe the common wisdom, and maybe where lean might have led us astray?
Yeah, sure. So let me do that slightly out of order, more chronological, because I think there was sort of a peak in understanding about where the ability to deliver more value to society with less effort originated, and then I think there was somewhat a valleying or bottoming out on that, and then what the peak should be. So if you go back to the 1970s, right? So that was an era of existential crisis for manufacturing. And there was this advocacy for getting advanced technology to deal with that existential crisis. And now, our technological solutions are in the form of AI and machine learning, but back then it was computer numerical control machines and automation, this thing and that thing. And there was a big investment in that, and then scholars started to notice that people were buying exactly the same stuff, but getting hugely different returns from it. So I had a colleague, J. Kumar, who did a study of numerically controlled machining and found that people were buying the same gear, but that on any given day, the folks who used it well had 40x the product variety and 3 times the productivity of people buying exactly the same equipment. And then some other guys who I am pleased to consider, colleagues and mentors. So as Clark Hayes and Wheelwright wrote a book called Dynamic Manufacturing. And what they were trying to point out is the same storyline, which was if you control for the product technology and the process technology, there are these extraordinary differences in the effectiveness of certain organizations to deliver societal value versus others. And the dynamic piece was that they were talking about a learning dynamic. All right, so that's going on. And again, this is coming out of, these folks are at Harvard Business School. Then over at MIT, you get this guy, John Krafcik, who starts documenting the difference in effectiveness. So John, when he was a master's student, I think now he runs Honda North America. He does the documentation to realize that apples to apples comparison, you have most auto final assembly plants with the same number of people in the same amount of space, et cetera, making more or less the same amount of product every day. But there was this small number, mostly Toyota, but not all Toyota, which on any given day, half the people were doing twice the work. And then this is actually the origin of the term lean. John was trying to come up with a title for his master's thesis and his first article. And so it was a natural. If Henry Ford was the godfather of mass production, and these guys were still producing, but they were producing with far less effort, much more, than if Henry Ford was the originator of mass production, and mass production was what was being practiced at Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and elsewhere, then this was lean in comparison. So the term lean originally was descriptive of the phenomena, less in, more out. And around the same time, a guy, similar timing at MIT, he was doing his doctorate, so he wrote a dissertation on a thesis. This guy, John Paul McDuffie, who's at Penn, he did another set of studies, and he said, you know, this phenomenon which Krafcik documented is about learning. And his first and really a seminal article was comparing problem solving in different plants. It was the same problem in different plants. And it gets back to this issue of feedback and learning, which was in one extreme, people would take reports and they'd at some point process the reports, and they'd take every presentation of the same symptom as having the same sources, it was the same problem. And the other extreme was the plant which every time there was, let's say, a leak around the gasket on a window, they treated each leak individually as having its own idiosyncratic cause and necessitating its own idiosyncratic investigation. Not surprisingly, the folks who were learning a lot more, a lot faster, their performance was in this category of half in, twice out. So if you think about the time frame.
Forgive me.
Yeah.
Which one had better performance? The one that treated each leaky thing separately?
Each problem, until you've proven otherwise, treat each problem as idiosyncratic. And then if it turns out they're not, that's fine. But the other one started with the preconception, bias, maybe not, but it started with the preconception that every time there's a leak, there must be a leak problem as opposed to lots of problems which manifest themselves as leaks. So anyway, that puts you late 1980s. And so what's the story between Krafcik and McDuffie, which is there's wild divergences in performance, and the root cause of that is the learning dynamic of the organization, which again is one of the few times MIT and Harvard agreed, because the folks at Harvard are writing dynamic manufacturing about the learning dynamic. All right, so that's definitely a peak. So then what happens? People start studying these lean manufacturers. And quickly the focus goes onto the shop floor and the things you can see. So what can you see on the shop floor? You can see, they have continuous flow, they have value streams, they have just-in-time, pull systems, Kanban cards, standard work, 4S, which is the placement of things where you actually need them. And you start seeing this identification of tools for the purpose of stability taken to a ridiculous degree. So I don't know if you've had the experience, you go into facilities and say, we're very lean. And you'll see people have actually put masking tape on their desk as to where their coffee cup will go and where their pen goes and their stapler, and that kind of thing.
That's psychologically diagnosable, by the way.
I'm sure it is.
Yes, for that.
Yeah. But you'll see that extreme. And of course, what that meant was they viewed this as a set of transactional decisions to buy tools in order to get stability. But to the continuous reference to complexity and the dynamic nature of systems, stability is an illusion. There never is stability. There's always adaptation. And so now they're taking, and you start thinking about it, you have these very, very complex technologies which are inherently unstable, which is why we have instrumentation and control. And you have those existing in ecosystems which are also inherently unstable and they're constantly changing. Then you're trying to take an organization and put on top of that to manage this complex dynamic environment, a highly structured, rigorous compliance audited system. And not surprisingly, there's a gross mismatch. This is my point about God gets a veto, is that the reality, whether it's Mother Nature, God, the universe, or reality gets a veto over your arrogance that you can somehow control it as opposed to adapt to it.
And just as a little side note, I think in the airline industry there are similar rituals, right? Like the stapler. That means there's a whole bunch of compliance rules about what you can and can't bring in the cockpit. You have to have everything into the lid.
Let me give credit to the airline industry, and no offense, but take shots at medicine. Because if you look at the data, these guys do some very dangerous stuff. And if you actually contemplated how dangerous it is, what they do, you'd walk everywhere. You'd never get on an airplane. I mean, if you actually started thinking like, yeah, I'm going to fly at such and such a speed, at such and such an altitude, and inside of a thing which was made with so many parts.
Pumped up tube.
But pressurized, made by people, some of them had fights with their spouses the day they went, before they went to work that day. You'd walk, right, or swim, but you never ever fly. But anyway, it's a very, very, probably one of the safer human activities to do. Well, where is that? Is because these folks have written codes and regulations and so on, right? This is structural, this sets the stage. But why do they do that? So they can see aberration, right? And so, the way I understand checklists in your world is that you declare a checklist. This is how we prepare to get a plane underway, because we may as well write down what we think is the best approach. But also, we want to use the checklist to say, oh, wait a second, we're up to step 14, and it's not occurring the way we expected. We're outside that boundary. We're now in an unqualified situation. But what ends up happening with these checklists? So then someone says, wow, those guys do really good work. It's really safe, and it's amazing what they do every day. Let's bring this to an environment where we're not nearly as reliable, healthcare. So you get checklists and a checklist manifesto, and I think that was probably the problem. Is that, so what happens in the translation? Now it's it's something that you impose on others, which Gene comes up with a checklist, and the rest of us have to adhere to the checklist. And we're dealing with a patient, and each patient is idiosyncratic in some fashion. We're going through the checklist, and the checklist now says, oh, hold on, you have a point here of non-compliance. Now the aviation community would say, oh, wait a second, we're outside our boundary of where we've qualified. Let's take a deep breath here and figure out what's different than we expected. What happens when people look at these dynamic learning tools or dynamic feedback diagnostic tools and treat them as adherence compliance tools? Say, well, no, keep going. But the checklist says something's wrong. No, well, keep going, because the checklist says you have to go from step 14 to 15, regardless of what's actually happening at 14. So anyway, tying this back to your question, where did the lean people go off routes, right? So what was the first evidence from the 70s and 80s? Wow, there's something here about the learning dynamic. And then what did Kraftsik and McDuffie say? Wow, if you've had that learning dynamic, your ability to deliver value is orders of magnitude greater than anybody else. And then what happens is that people start documenting, and it's actually very hard, and I think we've all had this experience, it's very hard to sell learning. How do you price that? I'd like to buy a unit of learning, please. Well, but you can sell a value stream, right? And you can sell a 5S exercise, and you can sell a standardization exercise. So you crash down to, this is all about standards, compliance, audit, enforcement. Now again, anytime we start talking about really outstanding organizations, and it doesn't matter sector, it keeps coming back to, man, they seem to be figuring out stuff far faster than anybody else. Whether it's Apple introducing new products, or Google introducing new things like this, or Toyota new product, whatever it is, it's like, man, they got to a point of understanding the market and understanding how to meet the needs of that market better, faster than anybody else, which gets us back to that peak, which is about the learning dynamic.
By the way, just you said something that, my jaw kind of dropped. Was they documented what they could see? It kind of reminds me of some of the work that you and John Allspaw are doing in terms of there's a stuff that we can see, the below the line, above the line. Can you just react to that?
Yeah, I think there's another term that's sometimes used called cargo culting, which is to try and obtain the results that someone has by mimicking the behaviors that you can recognize that they have. And this is an old term that's got a long history I won't go into. But I think we cargo cult a fair amount because we see successes around us and we say, gee, this is what they're doing, let's try and do that here, without having an appreciation for the fact that, number one, we're only seeing a small representation of what's actually going on. And number two, the conditions that exist here and the conditions that exist over there and exist in our place may be quite different. And so I think this has been one of the big problems. Now, I also think that we live in a complex enough world, especially in the DevOps world, where we don't have a clear idea of what's actually running in the system at any one moment.
And I have to, well, I saw your presentation at DevOps Days Detroit, and you had made this claim that everything above the line are all the visible behaviors, the interactions, the ticketing systems, whatever, and
well,
everything below the line.
And the mental models of the people who are doing those sorts of works, yeah.
And then you said everything below the line are the code and the environments and the database and whatever. And then in your theatrical way, you said everything below the line doesn't exist. And
yes,
it was.
And it may actually matter a lot.
Yeah,
it is unknowable.
And I want to point this out, which is I think we're agreed that learning is crucial. The question is in part, what kind of learning matters? How much of our time and effort is spent on learning, and how much can we devote to that? And how can we direct our attention so that the learning is productive? And one of the problems that we have in large, complex systems is it's hard to know what is it worth learning about. Mm-hmm. And we have tried to use the events that occur as messages coming from the system, the incidents, the accidents, the problems, as messages being sent from below the line to above the line, and then decoding those things. In fact, I just made a blog post called "Incidents are untyped pointers." It's a void star type device. An incident points to some location, but it doesn't tell you what's at the location, and it's up to you to go and make sense out of that in a variety of ways. You can do that well, or you can do that badly. We've been very interested in how it is that the people who are working with these systems are incorporating that experience into their understanding of where the vulnerabilities are, because that's a shifting pattern.
And by the way, I'm going to expose my ignorance. I thought I sort of understood this above the line, below the line, but below the line are the systems, the code, above the line are the things you can see.
The line is the representations of the system. So it's a line of representation. It's essentially all the screens. If you take all the screens and you line them up together, that's the line. Above the line are people, interactions, conversations, mental models, goals, a variety of things. Below the line are the things that are behind those screens, and you never can see that. And it's inaccessible to you.
And I think what I just learned from Steve's assertion is that it turns out there's stuff above the line that you can't see either, like mental models, learning behaviors.
The point I was going to make when you said, Mike, where you took me to where Lean went wrong is probably the same place where Agile went wrong, where Six Sigma went wrong. The ideal of that stuff, you said something I thought was profound, which was it was the commercialization of how to teach people to do it. It became the least common denominator was I had to train you Lean. Yeah. So I went in and I came in with charts and I did this. And that's exactly where the Agile Manifesto was a beautiful thing. Today, most people in the DevOps community get really kind of irate when a Scrum Master comes in and talks about how he needs to do something. Six Sigma, I think, comes from Deming. Yeah. But I was at GE Capital. I worked at GE Capital. I went to Crotonville, right? I saw how GE was trying to do it, and it was ugly.
Yeah, so Deming, another MIT guy. So there you go Beavers, right? But if you look,
actually, I think it's somewhere in the Midwest first.
Yeah, we'll claim him anyway. We don't know how to deal with it because MIT is now a very cool place, and so we're still having that old social shock. But Deming, if you look at his writing, he kept talking about profound knowledge, and a lot of the tools he helped create, which were appropriate for high volume, low variety, repetitive manufacturing, control charts and that kind of thing, were opportunities to see aberration, deviance, to trigger learning so that you could develop profound knowledge. Now, and if you look at Deming's, he had 14 points, I think, and his other writing, it was about the responsibility of leaders to lead their organization so that it was constantly developing profound knowledge. So what happens with Deming? Deming becomes Six Sigma, which becomes belts, which becomes like this Karate Kid thing. Hey, I'm a green belt. I'm a brown belt. So, and why are you a brown belt? Because my control charts have more variables than yours.
I was at GE, and I actually had a green belt, and I was responsible for a group of just early DevOps. Now this is like early '90s, right? So it wasn't DevOps; it was a crazy operations group, and I had to define my Six Sigma, how many defects per every month. And the guy next door to me, as a peer to me, manager, he owned a server farm, and his was uptime. And it used to drive me nuts because he would just have uptime as his defects, and I'm like, that's just opening the door, close the door. In other words, but that's how bad it was. We had one group, nobody in the organization understood that electricity was his Sigma. And my electricity was the culture of people creating this on Tuesday, writing this, how many lines of code. And so it couldn't have gotten worse off of where Deming, I've studied a little bit about Deming, where he started and where GE was.
Let me ask you a question though about this sequence, because there's something in it that I think is very interesting. And you named a list of things that goes back to, quality assurance, quality improvement, quality protocol, Six Sigma and all these things. And Lean seems to have been caught up in this to some degree, which is this sense that there is this thing that we are pursuing that is actually very valuable, but once it becomes popular, once it becomes important or recognized, the need to appear to be embracing that is so great that we adopt a language or we adopt a program and claim to have it, which then in some ways sort of sterilizes the thing itself. It makes it impossible for an outsider to know where Lean really is or where
or DevOps or
working or DevOps.
So actually, you're prompting a thought. So actually, the attempt to broadly apply completely inverts the thing to the point. I hadn't really thought of it quite this way, but so Deming, if his advice was how to drive in the direction of profound knowledge, it was because you were driving away from profound ignorance. And it had to be, right? And the Toyota folks, and so the only way to drive from ignorance to knowledge is acknowledge you're ignorant, right? And in the case of the Toyota folks, this whole notion of standard work, but with all these different devices and tools to find error, was a way to find ignorance. All right, now, all right, let's think about this. So that you have at least these two streams of thought, which is about identifying the fact that you just don't know what you're doing, right? They're really an extreme. You're inept, all right? And then it comes over into the broader society where we give people credentials, and it starts in kindergarten, right? You did something nice, you get a lollipop, and then right, and then you get a little star, and then you get letter grades in elementary school, and because it has to be more precise. When you get to high school, you don't have letter grades, you have number grades, because a 95 versus a 94 is more precise than an A- versus an A, right? All right. So then your whole career is about getting credentials and proving that you've qualified for the credentials, and getting the credentials where you're going to. Or pursuing the credentials where you think you're going to get them, because you don't want to get into a situation where you try for a credential and then fail, because then you're a failure, right? So now you have these folks who've developed this system which is premised on recognizing your ineptitude. And they're trying to deliver it to people who the last thing they'll ever admit is ineptitude, right? And so now you have these people who all they're trying to do is demonstrate credentialize, somehow demonstrate competence, trying to absorb a system which is dependent on recognizing ineptitude. So they can't do that. So actually, I think it's a sabotage. I never really thought about it this way. But these people who
sabotage. Of what by whom?
Of the learners that get to the non-learners,
Yeah.
right? Because if left to their own devices, they wouldn't ruin this thing and then apply it in really bad, destructive ways. But it's even worse than that, right? They're not left to their own devices. They have here, take this. It's a Trojan horse, right? Maybe that's what it is. Lean is the Trojan horse.
For what?
Well, because
destruction and
because
Let me follow on that, because I have a question that flows from that, which is, What kind of advice then, given that that's a risk, and we understand that that's a risk, and in fact it might even be, there's a kind of moral risk, because if I propose something that can be easily adopted, but gamed so that you can have the credential but not the thing, then I'm contributing to that, right? I'm contributing to the delinquency of an industrial system.
Oh, and by the way, as authors, this is a profound.
I was going to skirt this.
No. I'll go right there.
But the question is this. How could we construct, or how would you suggest that the direction or the guidance be constructed to avoid that? How do you make a presentation of a theory or an idea in such that it is somehow difficult to hijack or to make sterile?
Oh, so all right, so this sounds like the answer you'd expect from a guy wearing glasses and a bow tie from MIT. You got to teach people the scientific method, because and over to your field, and certainly aviation too, right? Which is you're constantly plagued by the fear that you don't understand a situation. So what do? You construct an experiment with more control than less, preferably, but construct an experiment and engage with an expression of your best ideas to find out you're wrong, right? And it turns out the scientific method and the power of refutation is the source of a lot of great human discovery. And in the absence of it, we'd still be suffering cholera in endemic scale and having surgery without anesthesia, right? But when we get over into so it's a loosely used term here, the social sciences, as writers, but certainly consumers of that stuff, we don't demand. All right, so here's the thing. All right, except for the people who go out and buy all these sort of like herbal supplement kind of stuff, most of us are really, really happy that the FDA required pharmaceutical companies to prove through all these gateways that their thing is actually safe and effective, right?
Like opioid.
Right. Yeah. Well, all right. So that's
Just saying.
I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm just saying, right? Ideally, but
who's ideal, my friend? Who's ideal?
No, but you get my point. Is that so that's one that. But this is why there's such legitimate anger about that. Aside from the human suffering, it's like the system failed. You told me that there was a system that demonstrated safety and effectiveness, and this stuff fails on the safety thing. And you didn't adhere to the standards you espoused, that you're going to constantly challenge new ideas, represented as drugs or not. But so, all right, so as lay people, we're really skeptical of stuff that comes at us which hasn't demonstrated, let's say, safety and effectiveness, that hasn't been subject to refutation and cleared all those hurdles of making it through without being refuted. But then we walk through the airport or wherever else it is, or go on Amazon, we buy all these books, which is how to be successful, charming, and witty also. And a lot of that advice, there's actually no strong empirical test, right? And so here's the thing. People are going to write books and run consulting firms because they want to generate revenue. And if people are going to buy that crap, then people will sell that crap. So really, who's the burden on? The burden is on us when we read something and say, hey, wait a second, where was the opportunity to refute that idea? And if we read through something and see there's no opportunity to refute an idea, we should reject the idea. So anyway, scientific method.
No, it's interesting. I mean, as I was listening to you, I actually, after a little period of despair, and when you say authors might be morally contributing to a profound wrong, but that actually, I was actually then followed by a feeling of hopefulness, because one of the most recent books along this domain is The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and it is all about the scientific method. I mean, it's all about it's yet another PDCA.
It actually comes in Deming again. PDCA, right? Is your that is your classic scientific method, right? Plan, do, check,
and he said in a very specific way, right? Is what is the least amount of work you can get to confirm that there is actually demand for this thing that you're trying to build, right? And the purpose is to state the hypothesis, confirm that there is demand, and then
minimal viable product.
Right, exactly.
Measure, learn, which is just another.
So it is, I think, one example where.
What I guess I was trying to, I was saying.
Just to land the point. Here's an example of a best-selling book that actually does teach very much a scientific method to the point that has influenced a generation of startups that all speak the language of lean startup.
I wanted one at the point that I think is great is like I don't think we do this enough. Just I know in our industry, like read a book and look for why it didn't work. I know what was wrong.
Yeah.
You read it, and I like all three of you. I read your complex systems originally. I fell in love with it. I read your stuff, the original Human Guide to Human Failure. I read your book and I loved it. I actually was guilty of not stepping back and being a critical thinker about. I thought that was really a profound point about.
Yeah, but there should be room for inspiration. There should be room for taking an idea and running with it in ways that.
Aha! Now
Gotcha. But any moment that we idolize, right? And to literally idolatry, right? We surrender to something being the final answer to all of our problems. We are idolizing the scientific method here. I mean, you read Paul Feyerabend's Against Method, right? You understand Tom Kuhn, also, by the way, from a reputable institution.
Yeah.
Before. And it suggests that this can go off the rails in all kinds of ways, right? And
Can you explain that though?
Yeah, I didn't.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Keep
Structure
going.
of
Why
scientific
do
revolution,
you
what are you talking about?
why scientific method could go wrong?
It's an utterly irrelevant discussion for the audience.
all right.
So, but read Tom Kuhn. That's all better than the Bible, by the way, right? So.
Sorry, this
I'm
is
a big fan of his, by the way.
There you go.
the structure of scientific method.
Structure of scientific
Revolution.
revolution.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll put that in the box.
Actually,
So the method is only as good as the questions that we know to ask, right? Because without the questions, the method is going to be useless anyway. So if we keep asking the same sorts of questions within a particular paradigm, that would be Tom's argument, within the same paradigm, we're not going to discover anything new, we're going to get locked into our rut, sell opioids as if it's the greatest thing, right? And so this is, anyway.
So you're going to make a point.
I was going to ask another question, and I was sort of leading up to this with the question about whether or not there's some moral responsibility for proposing things that can be misused, which is that there is probably a moral value to proposing things that are not easily misused or that can be used in effective ways. And so what that opens up to me is the issue about whether or not the work that we are doing in DevOps and the kinds of activities that we're doing now have a moral and ethical quality to them that is somehow not yet in the discussion. I can think about this in two different ways. One is that the products that we are using now have begun to have profound influences on the society that we're in. And so Facebook may have been a social network at one point, but now it clearly is a tool for political influence.
Right.
And we can't escape those things. And even though we didn't plan it that way, these are the outcomes that we are seeing because of the reach of our technology and because of the way it's connected. So we have, I think, the question is, do we have some sort of moral or ethical responsibility as we are building these things and how we are making them?
So one of the reasons I wanted to do this, right, is because, it was when the first time I met Dr. Woods. And I naively went up to him and I heard him present at Velocity, and I was like so excited because I'd read a little bit about Lean and some, I think I'd read Rother's book, or I read something, and I saw Lean as more of a non-deterministic, more embracing uncertainty. And when I heard Dr. Woods, I was like, oh my God, this is like Lean. And respectfully, he kind of like, Lean, no. And I'll go, and then I thought about it. I talked to Gene quite often about it. I read a lot more. I read your book. I ran into you in Brisbane, and you gave an amazing presentation about a walk through kind of safety history, and I grabbed you off the stage, and I said, everything I just saw looks like a non-deterministic model. And you were like, absolutely. And we had a further conversation, we had a podcast, and I said to you, can you do me one favor? Can you research, because I asked you, had you studied Deming, and you said no at the time. And I said, could you just research Deming? And then just let me know. Either tell me I'm totally off base, because if you embrace Deming, then I know I've got the nexus of everything here.
There's now your book.
And you about a year later, you sent me an email and you said you were right. And you said, by the way, and like to my heart, it's in the Safety Anarchist now.
Yep.
And so that, when I said to Gene, I'm like, I really want to try to get this conversation. And so the things I try to look for, like what are we, blamelessness I think is something that we all agree on. Psychological safety we all agree on.
you have to rely on audits, you're way behind the curve.
Right. So I guess that I wanted to try to drive to what are the things that we do agree on, because that was the purpose of trying. I think we've had an amazing conversation, but that was the thing I wanted to drive. Is I wanted to find out what are the your Nick, sorry, like what do we all have right at this table?
Right. Until we're proven wrong.
Right.
Right. This guy's
Strong opinions, weakly held.
Very nice. That's nice. That's
But that's exactly the scientific method. A strong declaration of what you're willing to give up.
Sorry. No, that's a nice way to
Do you want to start? Because I think there was some sort of like when you acknowledged, you said, "Oh, yes, I did read Deming's. I think you read Out of Crisis." I guess. And you said, and that's his 14 points, and you were like, "This does fit what we're trying to say."
No, very nice. That's true. So in the Safety Anarchist, some of the things that I certainly rely on is the point of blamelessness. That if you create a culture or a setting in which you blame people for making errors or not doing or living up to the spec, you're just going to make life more miserable for yourself and your system. Right? You might. I say to managers, it's like peeing in your pants, right? It feels really good and like a great relief at the moment, right? But you'll look like a fool and start to stink very quickly. So that's not. Deming would probably not have put it that way, but I think he would recognize.
He was
it.
a church-going guy, but
that's all right. I'm the son of a preacher woman. So there you go. But so, hang on. We've already talked about some other ones that were in the Safety Anarchist. Help me.
Well, Deming's you 14 points.
Yeah, but I'm not going to recite Deming's 40 points here. That's not.
Well, I mean, it was. I think some of the things that I think, like he hated MBOs. You were like this idea of this kind of deterministic that I could create a KPI, or he said MBOs because the new terminology wasn't invented. Now in Silicon Valley, it's called OKRs, by the way.
OKRs,
but
right,
same thing, just renamed.
Yeah.
But he hated that, right? Because it was deterministic, like this shall happen, and we'll check in a month or 4 months.
Well, and I think of another really important one that is very much related to that is, as we said, if you have to rely on audits to know what's going on, you're way behind the curve. And because the audits, I mean, Dave Wood says it beautifully, right? It gives you a very distant view of operations and not authentic. You want an authentic view, you got to be in there. You have to go operational, which is why I think Richard and I somehow, I mean, it's not that we valorize the native, that we valorize the person actually doing the dangerous and dirty work, but we certainly recognize doing it ourselves that there is incredible value to understanding that perspective from the inside out, right? The emic perspective, rather than the antic perspective.
John, would help. So you and I came up with a list of things that I think that were in the areas of commonality.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No. In fact, it would help.
That.
Psychological safety, blamelessness, integration of scientific method to improve daily work, reduction of bureaucracy and certification.
Yeah.
System thinking.
Definitely.
Complex adaptive systems and flow.
I mean, and I'm in favor of safety and quality too. The problem
as a physician, practicing physician.
Thank you.
What does that
Nice
even
to know if you have to.
but that's my
I'm
point.
against those.
That's just
My concern here is that these are aspirational qualities and things that we would like to embrace as values. And I agree that they are valuable things. But when we actually watch the way that they get enacted in real working situations, we find that many people will claim to have a blameless postmortem when it's not blameless at all.
No.
There are many people who will claim that they have a psychologically safe work environment when in fact it's a psychologically very hazardous work environment. And revelation after revelation, both in media and from our studies, suggests that it's a lot more conflicted down at the sharp end than that simple kind of statement.
But should that make us cynical or
I think,
rebellious?
I think it should make us
hopeless?
very cautious about taking at face value claims that exists in a particular location. I think it also we should ask why it is that those things are so difficult to obtain and maintain in those places, rather than say, oh yes, they have that, no, they're just doing it the right way. I'm particularly concerned about the fact that we are struggling to have this kind of openness and transparency in a world that is becoming increasingly opaque. Organizationally, structurally, the world has become much more opaque as time is going on. We have much more difficulty seeing into things. As I would give you the examples of the trouble, of the reports on various kinds of outages that we actually get, the kinds of information that we get about how companies make decisions.
But, just to backtrack a second, when you say, you're troubled by the fact that you can't confirm the behaviors are as reported, I mean, I think to Stephen's point, it's like, well, you should be able to tell from the outcomes, right? If we really care about the outcomes, you should end up with a safer, more productive, more innovative place. I mean, it's
But sure. I think to this point, though, that the decisions and actions that lead to outcomes occur so far in advance that if you wait,
Many of them, yeah.
if you wait to see the outcome, it's too late. What you really need to do is see leading indicators of the right behaviors, the right actions. Where
So
you
true.
say,
So
and
true.
that becomes really, really hard. I think it was something you said earlier. It was about the how do I value or discount an experience I might have? And the thing is, in the moment, I can put a pretty concrete value on social ridicule. And I can put a pretty high concrete value on social acceptance. So in the moment, to call out and say, I don't understand what's going on, or this doesn't feel right. And again, we were talking about biases and how we try to protect our, so one of the things that come out of Kahneman and Tversky's is this asymmetry between how much we're willing to pay for a reward versus how much we're willing to pay to insure against a risk. So in the moment, it's like, wow, I'm at a lot of social risk. That's going to really drive my thinking and my action versus, well, this might be good someday, but I'm not really quite sure. And even if it is, how much value will I be recognized?
There's a fig leaf nature to I fully agree with, in fact, both of you, which is probably no fun, but it's an important point, which is if we rely on a supposedly psychologically safe workplace to catch the types of trouble that should have been designed out of the system way before. We were relying on the last line of defense, if you want to use that language, to be both clairvoyant and heroic. And I think that's above the pay grade that we're willing to fork out for these people.
So good.
So
How do we get it
does that
right?
make sense?
Yeah, I mean, what it does is it really puts a huge burden. All right, so I've been making a lot of ridicule of a transactional view of management that, I can buy an initiative.
It's not a ridicule. That sounds highly descriptive.
Okay, but it puts a huge burden on leadership to cultivate and model. I think that was a point you were making earlier, which is not just to say, John,
You can speak up anytime.
You can speak up anytime you
But
want.
I won't.
But yeah, I won't.
No,
and
because I know everything.
yeah.
I need to be seen to know everything.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Which and I think the thing, the very few, and this gets to your point, why is it so hard to see? I think we understand why it's so hard to see, but the few organizations which consistently are much better than anybody else, you'll find leaders who go out of their way to humble themselves
That's
relentlessly.
exactly right. That's exactly right.
I mean, and
Never cease doing it.
right, and all right. So you get stuff like the servant leader, and it's almost like Versailles, where the nobility would dress up as the peasantry. I mean, it was expensive peasantry. I mean, this is
yeah. And then gorge themselves anyway. Yeah,
right. They'd gorge themselves anyway, right? But they dress up. But it was like somehow, I'll noblesse oblige. Is that how it's said? Right? I'll bring you the.
Yeah. We'll do as if.
I'll bring you the cup of tea, but knowing that we're faking it.
Yeah.
Right. As
That's
opposed
easy.
to true humility and modesty, and again, encouraging, making it safe for others, and demonstrating what it looks like.
That displays the cynical opposite of it,
Yeah,
actually.
right.
Yeah.
And responding to your question, John, I think one of the things that I would say, as we look at resilience and try to understand where the sources of resilience are in organizations, and by resilience I generally mean the sustained adaptive capacity. But if we say, where does resilience come from? It doesn't come from a thing. It comes from a whole bunch of different things
That
with
interact.
various different sorts of time scales, some of which are very long.
Yeah.
So there are things that have time scales that are on the order of decades or even centuries, and that's professional organizations, our sense of responsibility, what it means to be a participant in these sorts of activities, the kinds of education,
the do no harm
experiences
ethic,
that people
thousands of years.
all of these things take very long times to develop. And I don't foresee a time in which we are so good at predicting the future and the systems that are in it that we're going to be able to take away the need for people to make difficult decisions at the point of contact. And so what I think we have to think about is, what do we need to do to prepare people to be in those roles? Sidney's a pilot, and a pilot has a set of technical competencies, has some abilities to do different kinds of things, and process things in certain ways. But what we also depend upon the pilot to do is to make the right kinds of decisions based upon the right kinds of values and judgments. And those come from long kinds of experience being part of that group of people who are pilots, and what does it mean to be a pilot.
And having a stake in it yourself.
But
First one to know of the crash.
It's also true about what it means to be a physician or what it means to be a nurse. And one of the things that I think that is truly missing in the world of DevOps is what it means to be a DevOps person, in the sense of belonging to a group that has an ethic and a profession and a basic set of values that transcend the current employer or the current employment setting. And I think we rely in the space of, for operating our most hazardous and most valuable systems, on people like that. I mean, look at the kind of training that one gets to be a military person who's in charge of large weapon systems, or a pilot or something like that. But we've done very little in terms of building that kind of
but you can't engineer that in. I mean, part of the problem is this is a fast-forward profession, right? They've developed within a couple decades. No. So the problem then is if you start engineering it, I think we're back to what some ideas that Steve was suggesting, that all we give them is a simile of values, and we sell them the made in China glitzy plastic version of it, right? Oh no, we have these values, right? But they're not. They don't, right?
We even have a
so how do you avoid that? Can you fast forward this?
I would propose.
Fast track it.
I 100% agree with you. I agree with you. We don't, and IT has just been a zigzag, right? We call ourselves computer science. We don't hardly do science now. We do a little science because of some of the stuff that's happened coming out of Google. But I want to go back to the way you were describing Toyota. Toyota created a way of thinking that allowed people who weren't like in today's, they didn't have the pedigree, right? They did it there, right? Didn't they create they created the sharp edge that allowed people to do scalable delivery of things. Wasn't it solved?
Yeah, so I think this point about identifying, what you both were saying about identifying with the professionalism of a group, my experience is that you will meet out in the industrial world a lot of people who might have worked for the General Motors Toyota joint venture. More often than not, they were General Motors employees. I very rarely meet ex-Toyota employees out in the world looking for work saying, hey, I used to work for Toyota. And I think it is because they know when they leave Toyota, they will not find the same professional ethos wherever they go. I don't know about the IT world nearly as well as that world, but I find it also, you rarely find people who used to work at Apple. I used to work at Apple and you should hire me because I've got some, because again, I'm willing to bet the folks who work at Apple realize that if they leave not only, they leave that professional ethos, and that's a huge sacrifice for them. Now, to tie it back to Toyota, because that's where you got us started. So people, again, have often made the mistake of copying Toyota's shop floor tools and practices. My experience with Toyota is that they explain their shop floor tools and practices first by the emotional and even moral elements, and then say, oh yeah, by the way, it helps us control our inventory. So when you ask the Toyota, the real luminaries there, I mean, kind of like the Jedi Knights, Obi-Wan Kenobis of Toyota. So why do you guys do a pull system? Yeah, there'll be a hand wave, it synchronizes this dynamic system, but I said, because someone decides to give up a third to half a year's salary to buy one of our products. Now, if we have a factory organized like a normal factory, no one will get a sense of the work they're doing is in response to the trust given to us by the person who's investing 3, 6, 9 months worth of earnings to buy our car. But with a pull system, when someone takes a car and that triggers the production of the pieces that go into that car, and that means that someone who's 2 and 3 and 4 layers back in our supply chain will understand that someone trusted them that day. And don't you want to go to work knowing that people trust you to do your job right? And oh, by the way, we make cars. I mean, it's really...
It was in the original, the contrast between Sloan and Ono, right? Sloan, I think, said,
CEO
we're not in the
General Motors.
General Motors,
Right,
yeah.
back in the day.
We're not in the business making cars, we're in the business making money. Ono is like, we're not in the business making cars, we're in the business making great people who make great cars.
Yeah, no, so that's exactly, actually, so I'll just add this. I recently had the chance to attend the 25th anniversary celebration for a group within Toyota, originally called the Toyota Supplier Support Center, and now it's called the Toyota Production System Support Center, all right? So think about it. This TPS thing requires support, right? I mean, that's why they exist, to support this management system. And the folks who work in that organization, their job is to teach this way of managing other people, some in suppliers, a little bit in their plants. They have a sister organization which really does the plant work, and then to unaffiliated organizations like food banks and people who build housing for emergency, post-flood relief and that kind of thing. So a couple of things about this event. I'm sitting there with my mentor, Kent Bowen, right? And he looks around, there's like 300 people at dinner. The Secretary of State of Texas is attending. They've flown people from long retired leaders of Toyota have come to this event. And he said, son of a gun, look at the big deal they're making about an organization which has never had more than 25 people. It was all right. And then, what is this TPS thing, the Toyota Production System, that they're the supporters for? All the presentations, people coming down and say, the Toyota Production System, what's it about? It's about engaging people in problem solving to meet society's needs. And whether it was a guy who said it in Japanese, was translated to English, a guy who said it in Japanese, which came out of his mouth as broken English, or a guy who just said it in English, it all came back to engaging people as problem solvers to meet society's needs. We're there for like 8 hours. No one mentioned cars.
Yeah. Well,
8 hours. It didn't come up once that they happen to sell cars.
Right. So the first time today, I heard oohs and ahs. Things he was saying, you were like, ah. So I mean, based on what he just said in that description, let's play the Nick game.
Well, it's beautiful.
What are the positive things that?
Well, but so where safety thinking has been going in the last few years, and I mean, Richard has been instrumental in driving in that direction as well, is to indeed don't see people as your problem that you need to control through tighter proceduralization. No, people are your problem solvers.
Right.
They do this dangerous and dirty work every day. They solve the problems for you. Don't think that you should tell them what to do because they actually know what to do. That's why you hired them, right? Just ask them what they need. What do you need to be successful, right? And the third one is, and we talked, we rather than pursuing the negatives and trying to reduce the number of negatives, try to understand why things go right and enhance the positive capacities that make it so. And I think that is entirely consistent.
Yeah.
I think that I might have a little reluctance, which is based upon the idea of tying this to a corporate organization or a corporate structure, because I think that in some ways, when I'm talking about the people and their capacities and resilience, should not be dependent. It shouldn't arise just simply because they have an association with a particular firm.
But it was the ethos, though, right?
But let me back up.
That transcends in pilotage.
I think that that pilots are pilots who happen to fly for a particular airline.
Wear a particular uniform.
And wear a particular uniform.
Yeah.
And if I were going to chart a path for DevOps, if somebody said to me, what should we do to ensure the future of DevOps? It would not be build a better tool chain.
I think everybody, we all agree with that.
It would be find ways so that the young people who are entering into this can get the kind of professional mentoring and apprenticeship experiences over a long enough period of time that they can actually develop those skills.
But could we learn from that model? I agree. Now I'm with you that pilots have an ethos across pilots, not corporations, right? But is there enough there from what he described to learn to try to expand? And then I think that everything we've done so far in DevOps is to try to learn from Lean. We spent a lot of time trying to draw wrong and right examples.
I think
but is there enough there?
If you look inside companies, that you would find that there's much more heterogeneity within companies than most of us would like.
I agree with that.
And that there are places of great strength and places of great weakness.
Yeah.
And the question for us really should be, where are those places of great strength and why are they so strong? What is the kind of thing that makes that so functional? And in the few places that I've been able to study, and I've looked at a dozen or maybe a little less than that.
And by the way, I can give you access to 23,000.
Okay. Well, but the kind of study that I'm talking about doing is actually going and watching the work really happen and spending time with people looking at, particularly at the problems that they have, is that there are in such places a cadre of experts, of people who have long enough experience there and high enough levels of trust from above and from below that they become the kind of they're the kind of bellwethers for what matters. And people trust them, they trust their judgment, they trust their discretion, they trust their behavior in ways that allow them, that give them good models for them to emulate and that they pursue that. And I think structuring environments like that is going to become more and more important.
I just want to make sure that I heard the last 30 minutes correctly, because I actually rattled off a list of terms that are more associated with safety culture than terms that in a spectrum, and the ones that were more associated with lean, Toyota, so forth. And what I heard was just wild agreement that was like that was too easy, even though it was more aspirational. I mean, did I hear just what I wanted to hear? That we have some.
No, I'll put it for you a different way. I'd say forget about lean and forget about safety culture. Stop using those terms. Just drop them. Forget them.
No, it's on the bottom third, the chirons.
They misdirect us more than they help us.
Yeah,
we have to go and look into this work itself and understand it in the kind of detail that allows us to see how people are grappling with these problems and find ways to make that grappling easier, more effective, better for them. And I think it's a mistake to conflate this with some sort of almost almost a political agenda, if you will. It's a wrong term.
It's made for great TV, by the way.
Well, it might, but I think when we use terms like that, safety culture, lean, and other things, we evoke in people a whole bunch of responses. And I'm not sure that's what we want to do. Yeah, I think what we want to do is we want to say to them, we're really interested in the problems that you have carrying out the work that you're trying to do. Can you show us more about where those problems come from? Can you tell us what the kinds of risks and hazards that are surrounding you? We have to begin to do that, irrespective of what kind of labels we later want to put on.
But this is the problem of scale, right? It goes back to why did lean fail, right? Maybe they weren't bad actors. At scale, sometimes you have to abstract it down to something. I've got Sidney Dekker, he's speaking at my conference. Well, who is he? Okay, what do I do now? He's a safety, he's a factor safety, resilience engineering. Okay, I come in, I want to help you. How are you going to help? So I 100% agree with you, but I think we have to put abstractions on things, and
even in the bios.
And even like I predict that most of those people who tried to train lean were not bad actors. They just had to come in with a suitcase and do something to teach ideas. And
yeah, I don't know. Labels matter a lot. It's a phrase you've used before, but to take a term and unpack it and be habitual in the unpacking of terms, I think is important, because our natural tendency is to have something which we've described with a lot of detail and granularity, and then we label it. And in the moment of the label, that's okay, because we've collectively arrived at that description, and now we can put a label on it, and we all know what that means. But then we take it and we give the label to somebody else, and they haven't gone through the packing process. So now they unpack it in their own particular way. So anyway, depending on just plain English or whatever language is your language, I think is important.
And maybe not the
Levi-Strauss came up, so one of the kings of anthropology, right? Levi-Strauss came up with a criterion that is, perhaps puts the bar really high or really low, I don't know, but he said, is it good to think with? Which is a very French way of phrasing it, obviously, but is it good to think with? Is safety culture good to think with? Or is it actually bad to think with? Does it send us down a rabbit hole? Is situation awareness good to think with? Is root cause good to think with? And we all have opinions about that. I think there's a need for a balance a little bit. You don't want to reinvent the wheels through sort of an assumption of grounded theory, that simply by going in and watching the wolves mate for long enough, we can build theory about how these things work and don't work for them. Absolutely, we have to be sensitive, deeply sensitive to the operations of the actual group. But it is, by the way, naive to think that we would do that even if we don't bring any terms, that we have no models and background anyway, because we do, of course. Our observations, our discussions are driven by things we've seen before, right?
And is it naive?
Yeah. I just want to join in this. I'm spending a lot of time the last while helping my kids with math.
Right.
And turns out labels are wicked important. You know, if an angle is corresponding or same side, interior, whatever.
Yeah, no, that matters.
Those terms matter.
Help you actually provide.
No, I think I'm helping. But again, all the social pressure is I have to believe I'm helping, right? You know, I can't be.
Yeah,
but,
this is true.
But
marital pressure.
Right. So the point is that there's a concept and there's a fluency which depends on understanding the symbols. But there's a process to that, and you can see it with the kids. If they use the symbols too soon,
right?
They don't.
You stumble, you trip.
They
you
don't have
lost.
the fluency to apply the ideas later on, and I think that's what we're.
Very true. And I think that goes to, root cause is probably not good to think with. I think it misleads all kinds of things. And so here's why.
Well, no, actually, can you pause that for just
why
2
do I need
minutes?
to pause that? I was
Reflect.
going to explain.
No, I know, because
we're going to run out of time.
Meta for a moment. I would like to say the observation, right? I mean, if I were to plot the number of frowny faces, to happy faces, I would say just even the course of the last few hours, right? The number of happy faces going up, the number of frowny faces going down, right? So I think just even in this time together, we're sort of converging.
What does it have to do with anything?
Well, not just in terms of like, is it safety or lean? It's I think we're sort of transcending that label.
But harmony is a false goal to have when it comes to a group. By the way, it's a pretty bad idea, right? Group think, and then you anyway. So
let's go to root cause.
So root cause. So backtrack. So is it good to think with? Is a great question to ask. And then at some point, somebody needs to make a judgment. Is it good to think with? Is it not good to think with? And there, I think it is useful to take guidance from those who've been there before. And in fact, it would be stupid to not take guidance from those who've been there before. And healthcare has been down the root cause hole. Aviation's been down the root cause hole. What we find is obvious. I mean, a cause, first of all, is a choice. It's not something you find, right? Eric Hollnagel says it beautifully. A cause is something you create, you invent, you construct. You say that's the cause, right? Versus this is the cause. Well, a cause also has, if you think in Newtonian terms, is also an effect of another cause. So where do you stop? And there already the problem lies. What is the root? When does it stop, right? There is no root because it only stretches as far as your imagination, right? And so what we then have to reel back is say, where can you make meaningful changes in the stuff that you discuss and discover, right? That would be, Jens Rasmussen's question. I mean, the root cause is pretty much not only where you stop looking, but where you begin losing confidence that you can do anything about it. And so the root cause is obviously the Big Bang, but that's not really where we need to go back to fix all of this, right?
So I think, in the root cause, I also have objection to it because I think it often gets misinterpreted as playing towards this transactional. Oh, I found the cause. Right.
And also, and then blame is easily connected to it.
And the problem is that person either didn't have the right thing in transaction or made the wrong decision, and that's the cause.
That's bad language.
Right? But if you really think it through, why do things go wrong? Is because we didn't know how to make them go right. I mean, if you really have to go to root cause, the root cause of everything is ignorance. I just didn't understand. in the moment when I had to act, I didn't know what I was trying to achieve, or I didn't know how to achieve it, right? And so you go root cause like a lot of people do. It gets down to a technical fault. Oh, we need to buy that gizmo because if we had that gizmo, we wouldn't have had that problem. Or that person needs training because if that person had that training, we wouldn't have had that problem. It begs the question, if it's so obvious now that you should have had that gizmo, exactly right. Why didn't you have that gizmo? Because you didn't know you needed it, right? So anyway, I think that frames it different.
Great highfalutin ideas, but for the vast majority of the population, their cultures don't accommodate these. They have the wrong tools to think. What do we do then?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly sympathetic with that, but I guess I would say that I think Again, this depends a little bit upon our loose notion of what culture is and how badly we use that, how badly we structure use of that term.
No kidding.
I would claim that these people are doing that learning anyhow. And they're encountering these things and learning about them very often in spite of our management systems, in spite of our organizational structures. They're not learning because of them, they're learning other things. And they're not always learning what we would hope that they would learn. Sometimes they're learning what not to say and what not to raise. Yeah. But the idea that people are not learning is, I think, a mistake. People are learning all the time. They're learning, they're avid learners, and they constantly learn. Yeah. The question is, do they learn in ways that are productive? And I think that I would argue that this is where this professional kind of requirement actually plays a role. And if you get a group of tech people together, and you get down, out of the structure of a formal meeting, and you say to them, tell me about the problem that you had with thus and so. I hear that was a pretty bad outage. Oh yeah, that was really terrible. We were really down. And they'll tell you this story that's very, very persuasive about all the things that went wrong, all the difficulties that they had, and all the rest. What do tech people do when they get together? They tell stories like this. It's what we did last night at dinner, right? Yeah. We sat around and told horror stories. Why? Because that's how we learn. We really do pay attention to this stuff. We really are concerned about it. And we learn about this not because somebody says, you, go learn. We do it because that's who we are.
Interesting, Rich, the ethical commitments and the values that you spoke of earlier that the profession lacks because it's too young, actually, I think, emerge from these stories that they're telling, because the stories sit on a bedrock of assumptions of what is right and what is wrong, because that ultimately is the ethical question.
And we could do better. We can make that better.
Exactly.
We can improve that.
That's exactly the value, exactly.
We can make that better, but we have to go where they are.
Oh, by the way, they're here. Yeah. So, it's interesting. I find that very hopeful because you and I had a conversation in Detroit, and I had made this claim that I think it's going to be our field, the technology field, that will deploy these wonderful thinking patterns, mental models, lessons. It will be the first to deploy them at industrial scale. And I think the fact that there's this conference where 1,400 people converge upon. There's an intrinsic motivation for them to learn, right? They're here because they feel a part of something bigger. They you heard almost the applause when Ron Forrester from Nike said, the first thing when they started talking about these DevOps patterns was, wait a minute, does that mean I have to wear a pager? Wait, no, pagers are for the other people. But he said the most important thing is that we had to create a culture of responsibility. You build it, you're responsible for it. And it was just
your passion and John Osbar, his passion, the stakes are high. Hal Varian, his title at Google, I don't know if he's still there, he was a chief economist. So imagine that your company has a chief economist. And he said, this was about 5 years ago, he said, we're in a state of combinatorial innovation. Mm-hmm. And that's how we created the Cambridge, we called it
Cambrian
explosion of IT.
Cambrian explosion.
Because we're, you said Cambrian, there we go.
Cambridgian?
Sorry.
No, Cambrian.
But I think your passion is absolutely right. I mean, we have to get this right because all the things, the scale of what we're, IT on, like everything that we're going to do is going to be affected by somebody running some compute and network infrastructure, everything. And the ethos and how we do it, yes, we have to get passionate and put our fists down and figure out how to get, but these are the kind of people I want in the room to, that's, I always tell you, I wish I could kidnap you and just put you in IT and take you away from industrial.
Give my wife a job.
But I'm going to say, John, those people are already there. And the biggest job that we have is to find them, to raise up what it is that they are doing, to make it clear that that is what we value as well. Those people are there. I encounter them every day. I encounter them here.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, just to amplify that point, in the context of where are the amplification points, I mean, I think the people here, they've all self-selected, right? They care about this. In fact, there's even the language of, historical significance. These are the change agents. I guess, these are people who are taking sometimes vast risks to overcome very powerful incumbent systems. And so I would sort of submit that what a powerful ingredient to have when you have a whole bunch of people raising their hand, saying, I am one of these people who am willing to take personal risk.
Yeah. So the cup is definitely half full. You're here. We're all here, right? I mean, I know you look at DevOps and you have these questions about DevOps, but I think to your point, right? I mean, I think we can. I mean, like Gene said, there are self-selected people here who are coming here to try to find the right navigation.
So I think DevOps has a variety of opportunities that are really revolutionary. One of the important ones is that DevOps is at least potentially a great equalizer across a set of social and class, gender and race activity divisions that we might be able to find some common ground in, and where the idea of a meritocracy that's unconnected to those things is possible.
There's a way to go.
And this would be a revolutionary change for our society, not just for the way we do IT. I think DevOps has the opportunity to engage a whole bunch of bright people in ways that are much more productive for them than the things that they have done in the past or that they might end up doing. And so I think it's a beautiful source of the kind of complex relationships and technologies and things that young people are fascinated with and would love to be involved in. And so I think the question for us is, how do we open those doors? How do we bring them in? How do we give them the opportunities? How do we mentor them so that they become those reasonable, rational, thoughtful, ethically judgmental people who we want to be running the systems in the future?
I think we've already answered. You spoke at DevOps Day Detroit. We finally got you to speak in an enterprise DevOps this morning. People got to hear your stuff. They're going to read your book. You spoke here 2 years ago. I think we're doing it. I mean, I think we got to get better. We got to get more precise. But
I'm going to turn the screws on this even further then.
All right.
So, and maybe just to resonate at this point a little further, people still tell me about how much in this community they remember your talk.
Yes.
That's nice. Thank you.
They always bring up the Godzilla slide about what decimation of the U.S. auto industry looks like. But I mean, they saw the relevance of your teachings. Same with you, Sidney. I mean, these are the people who make the mappings. They know how this will help them advance their cause. So my question, I think John, I'm going to give you a magic wand. We have these people for a couple more hours, and maybe even more. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you do to tap their expertise and their network and their everything that they've accumulated in the course of a career? If you could wave a magic wand, what would each one of them do for you to help advance this cause?
I think this. I jokingly call this an atom smasher, right? I want to get people who have really good ideas on how to deal with these complex systems that we live with, and get them. I think we've accomplished a lot here in this discussion. I think we continue discussion. You asked me this morning about this, and I said, "Oh, this year's easy. Wait till you see who we bring next year."
Yeah.
Right. Let's get some of these other people that have really good ideas, but let's just keep atom smashing this stuff, because I do think the common good pieces of you three brilliant men are really good. And we talked about the influences. What about some of the IT people who called ourselves computer scientists who really weren't, who were just bouncing like pinballs, right? And we got somewhere now we're really important, like Facebook, right? And we've got infrastructure. And when Amazon goes down, commerce breaks. Like, oh, now we need the grown-ups to help us, right? And the grown-ups, honestly, are you, and a bunch of other people that are in other fields. And we need your help.
Yeah. It's what we're trying to do with snafu catchers. I mean, that was the idea about trying to get to build an industry consortium that brings people together to talk about and understand these things. The key thing, though, is John, is that we don't have the answers that you're seeking.
So I'm not looking for the answer.
Well, okay.
I'm looking for the directional
we don't have the answers, and those are in the people who are already out there. The answers are over there.
Yeah, but the questions need asking. I think we don't have all the right questions either. But with some inspiration of having been in some of these things before, we have some questions to ask that might elicit the sorts of answers that we want to get.
I think the blast radius of your presentation this morning, I suspect, as I go through the community over the next year,
Maybe.
will have major impact. I believe that. Just like the blast radius
like
of you
Steve
2 years
said.
ago,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, we don't have it right. You guys don't have it right. I don't have it right. Gene's got it right. But I think the only way we get better, I kind of jokingly call these super patterns. There are these super patterns that in these disciplines that that seem to just show up, in holacracy even. Like, I don't want to go there, but and even argue whether you guys hate it or like it. But that you look at all these disciplines and they seem to be these super patterns. And if we could just keep kind of condensing them and then exploding them, I think we get stronger. That's my magic wand. Wrong or right?
In my quest for even more concrete, I'd love to hear any concrete advice, unsolicited advice that you would give us as a community from each one of you. Not questions to ask, questions we need to seek. What advice, given the information that you have, what advice can you give a group of people who are leading these, they're putting themselves in personal risk to help overcome incumbent systems that are.
So I'll take a shot at this. The general advice is this gets back to the ethics of a profession, is to worry about the consequences of getting it wrong. And I'll give you an example. So I'm working with folks at a pharmaceutical company, and you try to understand why someone becomes studies organic chemistry, gets a PhD in that, and does chemistry at a pharmaceutical company, and what worries them each day. So work with a woman named Beth who was discovering a high school friend on Facebook, and then realizing through his post that his mother had gotten an aggressive form of cancer. And she was promised 6 months, and the promise wasn't met, and she passed faster than that. What is the risk Beth is addressing each day is the risk that her work doesn't progress fast enough to help someone in that situation live longer, live better, do more. All right, so that's the example of what is the risk of not getting it right. Now, the thing about your world versus the more traditional industries affect traveled as fast as physical stuff. And the more effect you wanted to have, the more stuff you had to move, which actually meant it's going to move slower and slower. Your stuff travels at the speed of light or close to it. And so the ability to have really profound effect on very large scale, very quickly, the risk of getting it wrong is staggering. And I certainly hope, just like you were saying about pilots, they get on board a flight with 189 souls with them. What is the risk of things going wrong? Well, in some of the situations where there's this IT is more than 189, the risks are extraordinary. And I'd like them to worry about that.
In IT, it's not just one plane going down, it's every plane dropping in the skies all at the same time, right? These global...
Or staying on the ground.
Or staying on the ground at the same time, right?
It's having the screens that display all the locations of all those planes suddenly go blank.
And just to make sure I heard the advice correctly, is what you're saying is that can have negative consequences just because the spread is unprecedentedly fast, but there's an inverse that positive change can happen also at
the speed of light.
Is that the speed of light? Is that the amplification potential?
So I'm just going to play on what we've been discussing is the asymmetries of biases and how much we will insure against risk versus invest in a gain. And I think people should be highly motivated by the risk of not getting it right. We can always dream of if I get it right, the gain of that. But that's less motivating than what happens if it goes wrong.
And if I can dwell on that, just challenge it for a second, wouldn't that basically, aren't you advocating people being scared to the point of paralysis? And,
No. Well, listen. Paralysis comes about when you're scared and you have no idea what to do, right? I think we've been playing a lot with the etymology of words, right? So. Cower and coward comes from the same thing, whereas your brain locks up. It's like, situation, don't know what to do, freeze. So I'm not advocating freeze. I'm actually advocating action that
And this is where the stories come in. You got to maximize the opportunity for these stories telling, right? Because it is very difficult to generically sensitize people to the risk of getting it wrong, actually, right? And we know this. They'll go blunt, and it won't inform their action or their ethic. But knowing about stories where somebody did almost the same thing and actually did something really bad or whatever might sensitize them to it. And so storytelling, I think conferences like these shouldn't, but could build in more space for storytelling. Let me tell you the disaster or almost, or the near misses, right? And how did aviation get as safe as it did? Because it had the courage and honesty and openness and protection to start telling these near misses. Let me tell you how I almost screwed this up. So we need to systematically hunt down everything in your industry. Let me finish the recommendation. Systematically hunt down everything in your industry that puts downward pressure on honesty, openness, disclosure, and learning through these storytelling.
I took chills.
There you go. So I think the thing is, you know, when you said earlier, like when you were flying a plane, you knew right there what was the risk of getting it wrong.
Because somebody had been there before.
In IT, very rarely do we really understand. I mean, even like the night capital, I'm not sure the system administrator knew that day that that company was going to go out of business in 24 hours, right? But I think to your point, and Richard, your point, I think, I think the storytelling, but somehow get people to think about, like, this isn't just a computer. This isn't just a program. You are now.
Yeah, but you don't have to do it in sort of a badgering lecture.
No. I think that if you do the badgering, then we've gone down the negative.
Absolutely.
Yes. No, I totally agree. I read your book.
Which one?
Like 3 of them. Yeah. Only? Not all of them. No, man, I can't read that many. There's other authors out there, buddy. No, I think that's, it can't be badgering. It can't be negative. It can't be, kind of, some type of justice scale that you did this wrong. But same token, I think the messaging that I'm hearing is that we need people to really understand the impact. If you're at Uber, the impact of getting wrong is you shut down commerce for around the world. I mean, if you really get it wrong, nobody if in San Francisco and there's no more cabs, and you get it wrong, nobody's getting anywhere. And then what happens when nobody's getting anywhere? People are missing flights. Anyway.
I have to. I'm going to expose my reaction. I want to explain my reaction, and I think one of the things that we should do for next year's programming. One thing. The primary mechanism here to encourage experiential learning is through experience reports, but there is definitely the survivor bias. We are picking the best stories where the hero vanquishes the villain.
The risks,
And it occurred to me, right, that there is a whole dimension by elevating the sense of danger, by telling the stories, right. It is that is a need that must be served. So I know. That,
and we had that discussion last night over dinner. It's actually quite a serious one. There is a second victim trauma issue in there's suicide issues, and it has a lot to do with, of course, the loneliness of the profession and not feeling part of, or in any practical, natural sense, being part of a professional context that ups that risk. But allowing people to tell these stories in a safe space is incredibly.
And I know that all we have to do is ask. We'll have a list a mile long to do that. Yeah. What other advice would you give us? Thank you, Steve, for that. I know exactly what to do with that.
Again.
I would like you to. I would like you to try and create opportunities for reflection, not just for storytelling, but for opportunities for reflection about where we are and what we're doing and what our systems are actually being used for. I don't think we can probably do this alone or inside individual firms. I think that the culture of a firm, the environment of a firm, the circumstances of a firm are unique and create a particular ambience and environment. And I think we need to find ways to break out of the firm-based approach to things. And that may mean consortiums, collections, groups, professions that span different things. But I want to try and not put, I don't think all the burden of this should be on the corporate managers. And I think we should find a way to spread that burden across the collection of people who do this. This should be, for example, part of the educational system when people are studying computer science in their schools and their colleges. It needs to be part of that curriculum. And it needs to be part of the kinds of discussions that we have. It should be part of the interviewing strategy when we're talking to people about how they're going, you know, what kinds of things they want to do or what kind of experience they have.
So I'm a big fan of the circles of control, influence, and concern, and one is encouraged to focus on what you have control over. So if we gave you a venue here at the DevOps Enterprise Summit to, where you had people interested in that, could you help us structure that kind of exercise, something?
I think we could, but I think what we would do is we would call on the people that we already know from the industry and the people who are involved in this stuff, the folks who participated, for instance, in the Stellar Report preparations that we just got done.
Yeah.
These are people who are articulate about the kinds of issues that arise and are comfortable doing it and have those kinds of qualities. So yes, I think we can help.
And so specifically, you're saying John Allspaw might be a good candidate.
I think John Allspaw, but there are also people,
and
people who are not immediately visible to this community because they don't give presentations at that, but are actually leaders and thinkers. So one of the things that we noticed in one of the conversations that we track the Slack record of an outage and how people were talking and trying to solve it, okay? And one of the things that we noticed was that although there were very few communications from one particular person, when that person spoke, everybody listened.
Yeah.
And when you can find people like that, you found incredible repositories of knowledge, wisdom, insight.
Yeah.
And if you can find those people and bring them forward, that's a resource that you can call on. And we should be looking for and trying to find those people.
I know exactly where to find them.
That's good. That's good.